Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Social Media and Politics podcast, bringing you expert insights into how social media is changing the political game. I'm your host, Michael Becerra, Associate Professor of Communication at Lund University. Remember, you can follow the show on X at SMNP Podcast or visit us on the web at socialmediaandpolitics.org. All right, y'all. Thanks so much for tuning in. It's been a while since I've launched a podcast, and I'll talk more about that next week when we have the 9th annual Social Media and Politics Year in Review, a yearly tradition that everyone looks forward to. But for today's episode, we're going to be talking about, once again, influencers, content creators, whatever we want to call them, with my guest, Ryan Davis. He is the co-founder and chief operating officer at People First, which is an agency connecting campaigns and causes to influencers, and in particular, micro-influencers, so people with under 20,000 followers. And Ryan came on the show back in April of this year to talk about what are some of the strategies heading into the presidential election around influencers, because they collect a lot of data on looking at engagement rates, looking at sentiment when some of these localized small audience creators decide to go political or talk about political topics. So Ryan was kind enough to ping me after the election and say, hey, I've got some data, I've got some insights from the election. Do you want to have a debrief? And of course, I said yes. So in this episode, we're going to look back on the 2024 US election and just talk about what were the role of influencers there? Were there any changes in the types of ways that campaigns were using influencers? In particular, Ryan has put out data on a study that looked at differences between the audiences of political and non-political influencers, which suggests how they can be used differently by political campaigns, but also trying to broaden out the definition of influencer from people who have audiences on social media platforms to also Twitch streamers, in particular podcasters, which was a big topic this election cycle. And so we'll just dive into a bit of a debrief around influencers in terms of how they were being used by various campaigns. What was the kind of cross-platform strategy? How was that content that the influencers were making being repurposed to other platforms? I think it's interesting because we've been covering influencers on the show for some time now, and it's interesting to watch these strategies evolve and also get caught up on the state of the art. So I'd also like to plug People First's Substack called What the Polls Don't Tell Us. There'll be a link to it in the episode description. It's a nice resource to kind of stay in the loop in terms of what's going on the various comm side of creators and influencers. And last but not least, I must plug Ryan's travel podcast called Out of Office, because we are going to talk quite a bit about podcasting in this episode. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Ryan Davis. Again, he is the co-founder and chief operating officer at People First. Ryan, thanks for taking the time out, and welcome back to the Social Media and Politics podcast.
Thanks so much for having me back, Michael. It's been a very eventful election cycle.
It has, and we are, just a little bit more than a month out from the election. And I'm very curious to hear your reflections on how content creators factored into the cycle. I mean, there was so much hype around influencers going into the election. And so overall, do you think that we saw a full-fledged influencer strategy from the parties, or were content creators still underutilized this cycle?
So I think that, looking at both the Harris and the Trump campaigns, we had, a full embrace of influencers. Both campaigns, they had different strategies, but they engaged influencers. They had in-house campaign staff dedicated to influencer partnerships with titles like Director of Influence. And, when I look at the presidential 4 years ago, that was a very different case. Nobody really understood how to engage influencers. We were one of the only games in town, but now, looking at both sides of the aisle, we've got influencer shops that are working up and down the ballot for Republicans and Democrats. And I think when you look at the big takeaways of communications this cycle, influencer is one of those main points.
One of the things that I've been reading, there's been a couple articles in different outlets about breaking down the influencer strategies of each of the campaigns. And to be fair, I think as many people do when they hear influencers, they think very, very large audience sizes. So not the kind of micro creators you work with at People First, but still the kind of general sense I'm getting is that Democrats were a bit kind of scattershot in how they dealt with influencers. They maybe started to fund them a bit too late in the cycle. I mean, is that something that kind of resonates with you, having been working with this off the ground?
I think both campaigns could have embraced influencers earlier in the cycle. In fact, I think one of the big takeaways for Democrats has to be that we need a consistent communication strategy that is not like a year on, year off sort of strategy, and have more always on voices, not just influencers, but any kind of content creators, so podcasters, streamers, substackers, engaged in what we're doing. But I think you saw the transition on the Democratic side was pretty ahistorical, right? Having to switch candidates in the middle of the general election. Probably not going to see that again in our lifetimes. So they did have a little bit of a catch-up moment there, but I think the Democrats launched this Creators for Kamala, which was built inside the campaign that I think was pretty successful. And then, based on the reporting that I've read, Barron Trump was very persuasive that it was important for Trump to do all these different podcasts and live streams. And so they engaged really early and aggressively, getting Trump and surrogates out to all these different places. So I think you can always start earlier. I would argue that the Democrats or any political party should have an influencer strategy that is sort of always on, and not just what can we do in the 6 months before election day to change perception. It's like, how can we be persuasive, constantly keeping folks in the loop about what the party's up to.
Yeah, and that's where I'm curious, because it's hard to kind of nail down what are we talking about with influencers and content creators, right? Because then you bring in podcasters and streamers and these different levels of influencers from nano to micro, and it's just hard to get a sense of what's going on. And what I'm curious to ask you about is the challenges of an always on strategy, because I mean, in terms of campaign finance or something, where if you have the candidate that is going for office, of course, you want to have a sort of messaging blast in the last couple weeks of the campaign. How can you have this type of long-term relationship building with influencers, creators, when you're not even sure who that candidate is going to be? Like, how do you fund them? How do you keep them engaged? Are there problems with doing that financially or legally?
Well, there are, here in the US, we've got PACs and super PACs. So you've got plenty of places that are going to be spending money to share different types of messaging. Then you've got the national party, the DNC and the RNC, and then you've got all the state parties, and then you've got just a plethora of advocacy groups that are fighting for legislation and pre-legislation fights. So there's a lot of different groups that can spend money. It's not just like the Harris campaign or the Trump campaign are going to be running messaging. In fact, right now the Democrats don't have a clear leader. We're in the middle of our election for the head of the party, so we're actually in a very weird moment that we haven't been in, I guess, since 2004, where it's not clear who the next nominee might be. It's not clear who the front runner is. So, we've got a lot of things to kind of work out on that side. But I think that there are two ways that I would approach an always on influencer strategy. And when I say influencer, I do mean to include podcasters and substackers, because we talk about creators. It's people making things online. You and I are also content creators. You have a podcast, I have a travel podcast, I have a Substack, so I'm out there making content as well. I don't think of myself as an influencer, but I most certainly have an audience that listens to me about travel and about digital strategy. So I think on the paid side, it's thinking about how to work with creators over the long term that are not necessarily political creators, to help get the word out to more normie folks about what's happening, what the party's doing, what are good things the Democratic Party or wants to do for the country, et cetera. But I also think there's an old school sort of earned media approach to this too, where you're keeping in contact with these content creators across these different, content verticals about what's happening in the same way that you would email the reporter at the Washington Post. So I think we need to reimagine how we do earned media outreach, and we need to think about creators and podcasters, these folks as part of our earned media strategies.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And I did plug your podcast last time you were on, but I'll be sure to put a link to the podcast and your Substack in the episode description, which we'll talk about some of the things you've been posting on that Substack soon. But there's this interesting, I don't know what you would call it, kind of, it seems like an evolution where, it used to be all about earned media, and there still is, I think especially in the US, you have to have earned legacy media to be a viable candidate. But we also saw this really sort of massive adoption by the Trump campaign of podcasts to reach different audiences, as you mentioned. And so I'm wondering about this kind of dynamic where, it seemed that the Harris campaign just had all the boxes you would tick, right? Dominance of the media, tons of resources, digital ad spend, canvassers on the ground. Whereas the Trump campaign seemed as a disadvantage there. And I'm not sure if that's actually accurate, but I'm just curious, how do you interpret this kind of, on the one hand, the Democrats seeming to have more of a well-oiled machine, but still losing the race?
Yeah, I mean, so I think that a really well-run campaign that checks all the boxes, that has a good ground game and a good comms game and a good political game, that can move you a few points one way or the other, right? So there's always going to be historical headwinds and economic trends and other reasons why people vote. But I think this election was close enough that it's safe to say this was a winnable race, for the Harris campaign. And I do think they performed incredibly well in some of those traditional ways folks campaign. I think the ground game, for a large part of it, was really, really solid. They were doing real things in battleground states. I think if you look at the margins that Harris lost by in battleground states, she was able to keep her margin much tighter than in other states. Obviously, you want to win these states, though. So that's not that much of a comfort. But I do think the Trump campaign, they felt like their candidate could speak really directly to the audiences they wanted to reach, and could do these sort of long form podcasts. So I think you're going to see in this upcoming election cycle, where we're going to have open seats on both the Republican and the Democratic side, a lot of folks starting to test the waters by doing, more podcasts, more YouTube streams. You might even see some candidates, on Twitch, which I think is a great idea to reach, especially young men. So I think, ultimately the Trump campaign felt like that Trump could sit there for 3 hours and talk to Rogan, and that Harris, who I think could also do that and would also have been comfortable in that atmosphere, they just didn't embrace those non-political podcasts as much. So I think there's a really, really wild graphic that shows YouTube views of Trump content versus Harris content. And this includes Harris's appearances in legacy media up against Rogan and sort of the folks that Trump went on. He just demolishes in terms of just sheer impression numbers. And I often think about internet campaigning as sort of a war of attrition. Like, the winner is who ends up with the most impressions. And Trump really succeeded in generating a lot of organic content and a lot of people talking about him in a way that Harris, struggled to break out of that more liberal bubble. And one of the things I hope we get to talk about today is sort of that difference between the audiences of these political creators that the Harris campaign, really focused on, versus sort of the non-political folks that the Trump campaign focused on. And I think, Rogan's a great example of somebody who is, political, but if you watch Rogan, 90% of his episodes are interviewing comedians and interviewing sports figures. It's not like he's having Matt Iglesias on to talk about inflation and in a serious way.
Yeah. And let's turn to that study you did on political and non-political influencers in just a second. But I just wanted to kind of reflect a little bit on, I think in the maybe 2020 cycle and maybe a little bit even before, there was some candidates that were experimenting with promoting their own podcasts. So they would kind of create their own kind of election campaign podcast. And some campaigners I talked to said, like, no, we're not doing that. No one's going to listen to this. And so I think this cycle, we really saw at least attention to candidates going on to non-political podcasts rather than trying to make their own feed, which I think has failed from the start.
Yeah, I think, who's going to subscribe to a candidate podcast? It's going to be,
Right.
people who have decided, people, and there are messages for that audience. You want to move those folks up the ladder. If somebody's interested in Harris, you want to get them to volunteer, you want to get them to donate, you want to get them to spread the word, around election day. So certainly there's value in speaking to your base and to your supporters, but in a race that's going to be decided by, a couple 100,000 votes in, 4 states or whatever it really came down to, you've got to speak to folks who are not super engaged in politics. I think when you look at the groups that Democrats won this cycle, they won, really highly educated folks who read legacy media, who watch network news, more likely to vote for Harris. So she won all those metrics of like the highly engaged. So to reach those folks who hear about politics a little bit, but are not like hyper political, you've got to go into places where you're going to reach them. And I think, look back in the 1992 race, right? Like look at Bill Clinton going on Arsenio Hall and playing the saxophone. I don't know anything that Bill Clinton said in that interview about politics. I'm sure there was some politics discussed, but the iconic image, is him playing the saxophone, which reminds me so much of Trump serving fries in that stage at McDonald's. It's apolitical. It's who is this candidate as a person, and I think to engage in the podcast space and the YouTube space, you can't just go on for 15 minutes and like go through your campaign talking points. You've got to delve in and talk about your childhood and kind of go in more personal spaces. And Trump, he doesn't appeal to me as a communicator, but he'll talk about anything. So like, and this is a guy who's been doing, basically think of the equivalent of podcast in the 90s or the alts would have been like Howard Stern. He's been going on Stern, weekly probably for a decade. So he's just really good at this sort of like apolitical media and just sort of being entertaining and interesting.
Yeah, it's hindsight interesting to look back on because it makes so much sense. And at People First, we talked last time about how you have a lot of data solutions that harvest data and ingest data, and you've been using some of that to conduct a study that looked at the audiences and the differences between them when it comes to political versus non-political influencers. So can you tell us a little bit about that project and what your data shows?
Definitely. I think, this was one of the more interesting data studies we did this cycle, but we went to Wired Magazine, who put together a great list of influencers on the left and the right that were shaping the 2024 election. And these are folks, on the left who might be MSNBC commentators and who have YouTube channels who are talking about politics nonstop. And on the right, they're probably Fox News commentators who are sharing conservative views on YouTube and podcasts, et cetera. So we took an audience of those Democrats, and then we took basically some random creators who have worked with us on political campaigns, but they're not political creators. So, somebody in Wisconsin who's a suburban mom who mostly talks about her family life, but weighed in this cycle to support Tammy Baldwin and her race for the U.S. Senate, a race we won, by the way. So we broke down those influencers, and then we ingested their audiences. So basically all of their followers. And we said, who are these people and what are they about? And I think it's pretty stark when you look at the audiences of non-political creators. You see, folks talking about things like travel, health, wellness, major life events, et cetera. When you look at the audiences, the people who follow these overtly political creators, you see people talking about union issues, social justice movements, specifically about Kamala Harris in a positive way and Trump in a negative way. So these audiences are really, really stark. And I think one of the messages I'm trying to get out right now is, if Democrats want to embrace creators, and I mean that across all the verticals, they need to make sure we have a way to embrace creators who are not inherently political, so we can be reaching that persuadable middle, those moderate folks, independents, folks who are not self-selecting to follow, a political creator. And I think the data really, really shows that when you're speaking with a political creator, you're preaching to the choir. And again, there's value in that, moving your base up the ladder of engagement. But In a race where you've got to reach undecideds and persuadables, you've got to be communicating outside of that sort of liberal echo chamber.
Absolutely. And I think you write about this in the Substack piece that, the political influencers are great for primaries, for example, because those are the ones you can count on to take action and take higher actions up the ladder. But it seems more that to broaden out your base, you need to go to the non-political influencers closer to the general election, which would seem to kind of point to this like two-track model of targeting different influencers and their audiences at different times, which again makes me think about this idea of how can you keep those long-term relationships going if you're, investing in one at one time point and one at the other? Does that kind of mean they get too uncoordinated, basically?
Yeah, I don't think there's any one size fits all solution to, how you would work with influencers. But if I'm working with a candidate in a primary, I'm super interested in engaging political creators in the state that the primary is in, because those folks are talking to, fellow Democrats who are going to vote in that primary. But the second we shift out of the primary, I'm interested in partnering with creators across all different content spectrums who have audiences, that are less political. Because a lot of those folks are going to vote, and they're not going to be getting their news from traditional sources. Pew just put out this really interesting study a few weeks ago on quote unquote news influencers. And when you look at the percentage of Americans that are getting their news primarily from kind of like randos out on the internet, it's pretty high, and it's pretty high across all different age breakdowns. It's not just like, I think one of the mistakes is people think, oh, well, if I'm using influencers, I'm talking to young millennials and Gen Z. And like, absolutely, there are like plenty of creators who that is their audience, but there are plenty of creators who talk about family and travel, and even folks who talk about what it's like to transition into retirement, right? Who have followers who demographically are really different from Gen Z. So, I think it's time for us to stop putting in bucket, creators as a way to reach young folks, and think about who is on social media. That's a pretty, in the US, that the demographics for social media really look like the US, like, Facebook and Instagram and YouTube. These are used by 80-85% of the population, any given month. And so you're reaching a lot of people. It's not just the people you would expect that you're reaching.
Yeah. And I mean, I guess it also points to, on the one hand, it's super complicated, right? Because especially the type of creators that you've traditionally worked with are these micro creators that maybe not have the largest audience, but they are targeting a certain local or occupational niche. So there's a lot of those, but there's not actually, relative to the amount of people on social media, there's not that many that are actually trying to cultivate an audience and do something with a YouTube channel, or, using Instagram as a way to build a sort of presence online. So I'm just curious how you see that at this micro creator level. Like, yes, there's a lot of them, but there's actually not that many who are like taking this on as a hobby or even a full-time profession.
Yeah, and we think those folks are the best. Somebody who's a nurse who posts on Instagram 3 times a week about their experience, working as a nurse or being a single mother, who's built an audience of a few thousand people who just kind of enjoy following their adventures and their life. Those folks have really strong ties to they might only have 4,000 followers, but they have really strong ties to those 4,000. And so getting a lot of those folks is a better way to sort of reach a broader audience, and then taking that content and repurposing it. So you get that, that white suburban mom in Wisconsin, she posts a really compelling 30-second video. You take that 30-second video and you put it up against the voter file of other white suburban moms in Wisconsin. And you do that enough times, and all of a sudden they're going to be seeing all these different voices of folks who, look like they could be, they could go to church with, or it could be somebody in their community, because it really is drawn from the community. And that's the most effective. It's awesome to get Taylor Swift to post once, but if you can create sort of a surround sound effect that gives people the permission, right? In the business, folks talk about permission structures, but give them the permission to vote for Harris because they see other folks in their community are doing it. That's a really powerful way to run a campaign.
Absolutely. And I remember we talked about this in the context of Andy Bashir's race in Kentucky. So you've been really, leading the charge in a way with these strategies, the creator whitelisting, targeting through the creator's account, repurposing TikToks onto television, whatever, in the 22 midterms. But this has been the first, I think, presidential race you've worked on. And I'm wondering about how you've approached or have been thinking about what some people call nationalizing the race, in the sense of taking a local or statewide race and starting to talk about national issues, trying to frame the race as, something that aligns with the two presidential candidates. Because I think there's an interesting dynamic of these kind of micro creators discussing macro level issues. I mean, have you noticed a change in strategy or what works when it comes to a presidential versus a more local race this cycle?
Yeah, so I think if you were some of the Democratic candidates running, you wanted to denationalize the race. So, we worked in Montana with the tester folks, and they definitely did not want to nationalize that race. Most of the content we made was about the importance of public lands and how beautiful Montana is. And then we took that and we said, and to keep Montana beautiful, you should vote for a tester. Versus if you were in Maryland and you were Angela Alsobrooks and you're running against a strong Republican, you want to nationalize that race as much as possible because you want folks to identify your opponent, in this case, Larry Hogan, the Republican, as sort of a Trumper. So one of the benefits of working with creators who are based in a state is you can make that content fit the dynamics of the race. And I think, if I'm running, in a lot of states, I'm going to want to try to denationalize, right? If I'm Sherrod Brown in Ohio, I want to denationalize. I want to talk about Ohio stuff. I want to recruit people and surrogates who are going to talk about Ohio stuff and not nationalize the race. But the good thing about creators is you have the option to do either or, whatever makes sense for your comm strategy.
Mm. And I remember one thing that you said last time was about the positivity in reactions to when these micro creators start talking about politics, that even when the content gets scaled through boosting, perhaps, that even outside of their original audience, there seems to be a lot of positivity in the comments. And so I'm thinking about, on the Democratic side, this cycle with the so-called vibes, that this feeling of positivity, especially after Biden kind of passed the torch to Harris. I mean, did you notice that the positivity was even more this time, or was there perhaps something that seemed to temper that positivity in the comments as well?
There was definitely a lot of positive comments, specifically around the micro creators who participated in campaigns. We've largely seen that if somebody is a micro creator, somebody between 1 and 20,000 followers, the comments never get that brutal. It's when you start working with larger creators who have a following that includes people who are like active trolls against them and are getting outside of their networks a lot, that you start to see a lot of that negativity. On the vibes question, we were working originally for the Biden campaign. It was very difficult to recruit creators. When Harris took the mantle, it became much easier, especially early on. There was just a lot of excitement. So one of the things we monitor in an unstatistically significant way are things like, if a campaign's having trouble recruiting influencers, it means that influencer is especially hard to execute, but also that there are just fewer people willing to stick their neck out and say something positive about your candidate. You can sometimes see that in the data. Like, this is a problem.
Yeah. And, you also touched on this a little bit before, about the repurposing of content. And so even if someone, a micro influencer has 5,000 followers, the content they produce can still be useful for the campaign in other ways, and in particularly by sharing it across different platforms. So can you talk a little bit about the cross-platform scene this cycle? Because it just seems that the amount of social media, the amount of different streaming TV that people are consuming, it just keeps getting fragmented. How did that work for you in getting out micro creators' messages this cycle?
So I totally agree with you that another one of the big takeaways in this cycle is the value of online video, streaming, connected television. And that was something both campaigns did. Like, I think the Trump campaign did that very well. I think we did it pretty well. But what we did see this cycle is us providing user generated content, like videos from creators that didn't even go live on their profiles, that was repurposed for YouTube pre-roll and other kinds of online video and streaming. We ran a campaign, a couple campaigns where we were repurposing our horizontal video that we were having creators make, and we were putting that up on online video and in mobile apps and places where you would not expect it. So I think, gosh, I just read about a startup in New York that's going to put video on the boxes of the bags of the Uber Eats drivers. So, I think we haven't even like scratched the surface of like where advertising can go. The Harris campaign had enough money. They bought the Vegas Sphere. Remember that? That was a fun viral moment. So I think there are a lot of places the content can go. And one of the things that I was happy to see is that campaigns started thinking about how to repurpose it, but they could get even more specific in their ask. They could ask me for things like, a 15-second audio spot they're going to use to buy on podcast. They could ask me for, a 15-second horizontal video they're going to run on YouTube pre-roll. So I think there's a lot of ways that you could use influencer content on everything from door knockers, in a canvassing program, all the way up to, putting that content on, Netflix streaming and showing people that, before they watch a video.
So that's interesting. So what you're saying, if I have it right, is that you would have, or the campaigns would ask creators to create content that they could put on other channels, but not necessarily appear on the creator's own channel, like their home Instagram page or something.
And that was, because the Harris campaign decided early on they were not going to pay creators to participate in their program. Creators for Kamala, the program they ran internally, it was all about access. So you signed up, and if Harris came to your hometown, you might get invited to an event or something like that. The Trump campaign was, more comfortable paying influencers directly. We've worked on the hard side with campaigns that will pay influencers. We do find, though, that PACs and C4s and other outside spending groups, they care less about the idea of paying creators and are totally fine with it. Where campaigns on the hard side sometimes feel like they don't want to be seen as, paying people to support the candidate. But in my mind, a campaign is a huge apparatus that employs door knockers and phone callers and ad people and data people and, you name it. Those people work on a campaign. You're no more paying those people to support your candidate than you are paying the creator who might make a piece of content, give you the rights to that content, share it with their audience. There's a lot of work involved in that. Go through multiple rounds of revision. So, I think paying creators, to me, it's like a no-brainer, because you're paying them for a deliverable piece of content in the same way that you would pay your fancy, Madison Avenue advertising agency to make you an ad.
Right. And that's kind of what I'm thinking about in my head, is that before, of course, you would pay an actor, a professional actor, to do a sort of professional acting spot, which needs a sort of studio and rent the space and everything. Whereas today, people are more used to amateurish content, but you don't want to pay just any amateur, right? You want to pay someone who's comfortable in front of the phone, has the right lighting and stuff. So I hadn't thought about that, but it makes total sense that you would want to hire a creator, not necessarily for their audience, but essentially for their skill that they've developed to talk direct to camera in a way that people are used to seeing, because there's so many of those creators out there.
Yeah. And if you're, we worked with campaigns that were incredibly strict about the people they worked with. We worked with one organization that required us to run criminal background checks, on our creators. And that's the first time in 5 years we've ever been asked to do that. We gladly did it. But it was ironic to me that the Republicans were running somebody who was convicted of multiple felonies, and we were worried about if someone got a DUI in 2006. So I thought that was a very democratic thing to do. Capital D, democratic thing to do. The more you can, trust the creator to shape the message and how it's communicated. Obviously giving them the talking points they're working off of. If there's a reason why a young Black creator in Atlanta has an audience of 10,000 folks who are largely other young, Black folks in Atlanta, because they understand how to communicate to that group of people. That's their friend set, their family set. And the more you can hand over the keys for how that message is delivered, the more effective that content's going to be, not only when the influencer posts it, but when you scale it, to other people in that demographic category.
Yeah. And I'm also curious about, you mentioned it before, this idea of access that seems particularly important for creators, because when they are working in the brand space, for example, it's all about, getting paid, of course, but also having access to exclusive events, getting exclusive products, what have you. And if I have it right, you were working and I think leading a Kamala for Creators initiative where, I mean, of course, the best access you can give in a political context is to have creators meet the candidate or meet the principals on the campaign. So I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about access, how important it is to creators, how you kind of work with giving them what they're used to in the brand space, if that's accurate.
Yeah, so this is something that the both Democrats and Republicans did. There was a lot of access for creators, but I think on the Democratic side they had it structured really well. So I'll talk a bit about the campaign. So they started something called Creators for Kamala that you could join. And then, if Kamala was in your area, you would get invited to special events. And I think this was like a really clever part of what the campaign did. It allowed them to get a lot of non-political creators. Like I know the big event in Houston, they had beauty creators there, and they had local foodies there, and just people who were like very focused on Texas. And I think that is the right way to go. What we did is we started a group called Creators and Influencers for Kamala, which was run, outside the campaign. It was through people first, and we threw the largest influencer get out the vote event of the cycle. So we had over 500 creators come and hear from other creators, so folks who are doing influencing on behalf of Harris. And some of these folks were really political, and some of these folks were comedians who had done political posts. So it was a good mix. So that event really inspired the audience to kind of like, in those last 3 weeks, share as much content as they can. We set up a Slack where we were sharing positive news stories and things people should share. So, that was something that we just tried to do at the end to get, a little more momentum, from our massive creator database. So, we had folks that we were working with who were getting paid to do UGC for the Harris campaign, or might have been working on one of our dozens of other political races this cycle. But, there's only so many slots. So we have thousands of creators. So we wanted to give them all an opportunity to at least get involved, organically, and to feel like they were part of what we were doing.
Definitely. Kind of going back to this, using internet digital spaces to get people together. I know you had worked on the Dean campaign before, and sort of seeing that evolve into getting these kind of groups organized through MyBo and Meetup. And
yeah, you've been around a while, Michael, so you remember that. I think it's funny that one of the other takeaways I think that the campaign did really well is organizing and helping support all these different affinity groups. And there was like Black women in tech. We had the Creators in Kamala for Harris. I was part of Founders for Kamala, which is entrepreneurs who were supporting her. There were VCs for Kamala. I mean, you name it, and there were all these different affinity groups that popped up supporting Kamala. And I think when you look at the tactics that are effective in voter outreach, relational organizing, me talking to you, Michael, as somebody I know about why I'm supporting Harris, that is like the most powerful way to win votes. And I look at these affinity groups as a way to sort of scale that. So I'm reaching out to fellow entrepreneurs and I'm saying, hey, we've worked together on XYZ. I want to let you know about this group and why I'm supporting Kamala. And I'm talking about the economy in a way that would speak to an entrepreneur. Meanwhile, Black women in tech, you have these Black women who work in tech who are talking to other Black women they know in tech about why they're supporting Kamala. And I think the scaling of those relational programs is really interesting. And I think the campaign did a good job supporting, they sent out messaging and stuff to these various groups. But that's something I'd love to see how that evolves over the next cycle or two. And that's something that could only happen post-pandemic. Because prior to the pandemic, if you had said, I want to get 500 people on a Zoom call, you would have been looked at like a crazy person. But we're also so used to it now that even now that there's all these in-person events, I think it taught everybody a little bit how to be online organizers. So that's kind of why you saw that pop up this cycle.
Definitely. The technology changes, but still that personal relationship, the importance of that stays the same.
Yeah.
But My last question for you has to do with, the digital innovation during elections. I mean, elections, especially presidential ones. I know there's, God knows how many races going on in the US, but everyone focuses on the top two for the most part. And those really seem to spur innovation at the top, but also down ballot. So if you haven't mentioned it already, or maybe you have as we were talking, but what was one development in this space that particularly surprised you this cycle?
It's funny because I see most of the growth coming from comms strategies versus like technology. I think, in the year prior to the election, I was on endless calls talking about how AI was going to, be a big game changer in this election cycle. And the reality was, that didn't happen. There was definitely some AI being used, but it was pretty much just off the shelf ChatGPT to, spell check emails. I think that we were just a little bit off in the AI development cycle. And in 2026, we're going to see a larger technological shift to how campaigns are run, how money is spent, how media buying happens, how content is created, how campaigns as big, messy organizations are structured using AI. So I think that's going to be really interesting. But this cycle, outside of some of the growth in different kinds of digital advertising, video and out of home, I don't think there were any major technological breakthroughs this campaign, unlike looking back at like 2008 and being like, that's the social media election, or 2004, that was the year that Meetup made it easy for folks to kind of create groups that meet in real life to talk about Howard Dean. It is interesting that this cycle, I don't think the story is technological. I think it's more strategic.
Interesting. Well, we've heard a few times on this show that the best campaign tech innovations are simply those that help, like QuickBooks, helping you organize the campaign better.
Yeah.
So maybe
the least sexy innovations, right? Like we're all on Slack, but that's not interesting.
Exactly.
I do think AI is something to watch, and how that affects sort of the workflows and the comms of programs in 2026. I know there was some early stuff on both sides of the aisle. Quiller on the Democratic side, helping with fundraising emails. Red Letter AI on the Republican side, doing similar AI generation for email content. I think you're going to see a lot more of that in smaller campaigns because it's just so now. I ran my mom's campaign for state senate, 10 years ago, and the amount of content I had to make a week was pretty minimal. A couple social media posts, an email a week. But now even smaller campaigns are just going to have to play in a much more diverse, complicated content world, even in these smaller elections.
Yeah, interesting. But I think if anything, whether it's podcasters or Twitch streamers or the nurse with 4,000 followers, I think this idea of the influencers or the content creators are here to stay. So Ryan, thanks so much for taking the time and coming back to share what happened this cycle with us.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on. I appreciate it.
I've just been speaking with Ryan Davis, co-founder and chief operating officer at People First. Remember to check the episode description for a link to their Substack. And that's a wrap for this episode of the Social Media and Politics podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. Next time, I'll be joined by Dr. Anna Maria Duchek-Segiston for the 9th annual Social Media and Politics Year in Review. But until then, I'm your host, Michael Becerra, signing off from Malmo. See you next time.